does that mean? I don't know, it just sounds good. Care for tea? Right? Okay?
Literal is as you read it. Like, for example, Jesus walked on water. That means he walks on water.
Very good. The literal rendering of Scripture is just that. It's the plain sense of Scripture. When it says Jesus walked on the Sea of Galilee, guess what that means? He walked on the Sea of Galilee. I mean, there's nothing mysterious about that. I mean, it's just the straightforward sense of the matter. Now, that does not mean we take it literalistically. What's the difference? That's question number 2.
It could be figurative, or a symbol, or as we are reading, it could be a narrative, a poem, a parable, or apocalyptic vision.
Very good. Literal does not mean we take something just completely as it says, no matter what is being read. So when we read about the woman and the dragon, and the woman had wings like an eagle and flew into the desert, well, that means there was a woman who sprouted wings and was flown into the desert, right? No. You take into account the genre of literature of the biblical book. So, for example, the Gospels are written as bibliographies, as narratives of the life of Jesus. You read them that way. Okay? The Song of Solomon is a poem. So when it says her lips were like a flock of sheep, it doesn't mean that she had sheep in her mouth. Her neck was like the Tower of David. You know, what, she had this giraffe neck and all these stones on? No. See, that's being silly. Frankly, that's what I call just being silly. I mean, you recognize that this is a poem, so when it says that, you realize it's a metaphor, right? You read it like that. This is where the prophets are very sometimes difficult and confusing to read, because they speak poetically about the events that they prophesy about. You have to take in the genre of the literature to understand it best, so that you don't get literalistic about certain things. Does that make sense? But the very basis of understanding any book of the Bible is in its base value form. So for example, when we apply this to the Song of Songs, we realize on a literal basis, it's a love poem between a man and a woman. That's it. It's a love poem. Next. Is that all there is to it? No. And that's when we get to the spiritual senses of Scripture. What do we mean by allegory? It's a story is an analogy to something else. Okay? For example, Jesus walked on the water and calmed the storm, you know, when he got into the boat. An allegory to that would be to say the storms of our life that toss us and turn us and threaten to overtake us. When Jesus comes into the situation, he calms it down. That's an analogy. That's not what happened back in Palestine. You know, they were in a boat. They were about to sink. He walked on water. He got in and he said, "Shh, peace, be still," and the storm silenced, right? That's the literal historical event. But allegorically, we can apply it to ourselves and say the storms of life, the doubts that rage, the thing that rocks our boat. Figuratively, when Jesus comes in, he calms it. Do you see what I mean? That's an allegorical sense of that same story. And by the way, when non-Catholic Christians call themselves fundamentalists and they like to take everything so literally, you go to any Christian church and I guarantee you the pastor will preach a sermon similar to that. He'll talk about, you know, this was Jesus calming, and when the storms of your life happen, you know, I've heard this a million times. This was nothing new to me. because even non-Catholic Christians understand that there is a deeper sense here than just calming the storm. That's a nice event next. There's nothing more we can learn from it. The point to this senses of Scripture is that there is a depth to be plumbed that's beyond just the literal telling. Does that make sense? Now, anagogical, that's a tough one. What does that mean?
Points upward toward heaven. Glory.
It points to our ultimate end,
What purpose?
our ultimate purpose. How does the story of Jesus calming the waters reach to our ultimate end? When we are with Jesus in the journey of our life, he will safely take us from where we are in the midst of the storm to eternal peace with him. That would be a way of expressing the anagogical sense of that story. Does that make sense? It's how do we get from where we are to heaven? What is the lesson to be learned and how to move from there to there? Okay. Tropological, moral sense. What does that mean?
Reveals how the actions of God's people in the Old Testament and the life of Jesus in the New Testament prompt us to form virtuous habits in our own lives.
Good. It's to teach us what kind of moral lesson can we learn from this. The moral lesson that we get from that story is have faith in Jesus. He will calm the storms of your life. That's the moral to the story. You see that? And this applies to any, I'm just giving you an example of how to apply the senses of Scripture to any particular event. Because this is important, especially when we're dealing with a poetic book like the Song of Songs. We're going to be primarily focusing on the allegorical sense of the book, as we will hear in Group 6. Because that is what's going to matter most. Just reading this as some love poem between some guy and some girl, it's like reading someone else's love letters. What does that have to do with me? Who cares? They're in love. That's nice. Right? It has to have a deeper meaning. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. Why is it even in the Bible? It's got to have a purpose. And the purpose is these spiritual senses. Okay? Are we good? Okay, let's move on. Number 3, what are the guidelines for biblical interpretation? We just can't go off half-cocked, willy-nilly, believing, the whore of Babylon's the Roman Catholic Church because I hate Roman Catholics. Right? Remember, we've been down this road before. Right? Well, where do they get off saying that? And how do you refute it? What is the guidelines on how to improperly interpret Scripture? Group 3.
So the 3 guidelines are, number 1, the unity of the whole Scripture as its literary context.
Okay.
Number 2, the tradition, the living tradition of the community that it's based in.
Okay.
And number 3, the faith, that it doesn't contradict any of the doctrines of the church.
Terrific. That sounds good. These are all enumerated right here on pages 9 and 10. Okay. Number 1, we should be attentive to the unity of Scripture. Okay? What does that mean? That means you can't just pick something out of one part of the Bible and have it mean something totally different than the rest of the books are. There is what we used to say in non-Catholic Christian circles, you take the whole canon of Scripture into account. If you want to know what something means, look at the whole Bible to give you a guideline as to what it could possibly mean. You just don't take something half-cocked on your own idea. The number one error, I would say, non-Catholic Christians make in their interpretation of Scripture is they make their, what I call, modern bias. They tend to read the Bible in terms of modern understandings, rather than in the tradition of where it was written. The second rule is that in order to understand what this means, you have to understand where did it come from. That's why group 4 is going to be very important, because the author and dating of the book will give us an idea of what milieu did the book originate from, so that we can have an idea of the cultural significations of the symbols. Does that make sense? Because if we want to read it in terms of our understanding, then when we read the book of Revelation and we talk about the locusts that rise out of the abyss, we're going to be tempted to say they're demon-possessed helicopters. John saw demon-possessed helicopters. It's the end of the world. And it's like, that's bull. That has nothing to do with the sense of Scripture. It would be greater to say, how do we understand the locusts that rise out of the abyss? Well, how about if we go back to the prophet Joel? And he talked about the locusts that would come across the land of Israel. They weren't literal, they were figurative. They were representative of God's judgment that was falling upon Israel at that time. That makes more sense in how to interpret the locusts that come out of the abyss than demon-possessed helicopters. You see what I'm saying? So there is a unity to the Scriptures in trying to understand a particular text or idea, understanding it in the context in which it was written, and then the third thing is the analogy of faith. What does our faith tell us? Does what I believe contradict with what our faith teaches us? Then I need to change my interpretation. You see that? It gives us guidelines as to what a sense means. So you don't go off on wild-eyed ideas of demon-possessed helicopters. You see what I mean? Okay. Did you have a question now?
Oh, I was just thinking, how would that relate to like the theory of relativism? That example that you just gave for the non-Catholic Christians.
Relativism. Even non-Catholic Christians have guidelines by which they approach the Scriptures. One of the things that I learned when I was there was what is the particular framework by which you lens or view the Scriptures. Okay? Once you have that lens, then everything you read is filtered through that. People, for example, non-believing scholars, they don't have a lens by which they view the Scriptures. They try to deconstruct it without that lens. They say, if I just have no faith at all and I approach this piece of literature, how would I approach it? That in of itself is a lens by which you begin to look at the Scriptures. So we all approach it with a lens. What I'm trying to say is that the Church has given us certain guidelines by which we should approach the Scripture through these kinds of lenses. Does that help answer?
Yeah.
So if you're talking to a non-Catholic Christian, you have to understand that they come with a certain lens bias by which they're approaching this. And it's important to address that. Otherwise, you're going to be talking like this with each other. You're going to be talking crosswinds. Okay? I'm looking at the time. We're moving on. Group 4. All right, so that's all the biblical basis, just the Bible basics. And it's like, oh, there's so much there we could go over. Well, guess what? You have all the time in the world to go back and reread more thoroughly. Isn't that nice? And if you have more questions about it, come back with them next week. How's that? But they're right here. This is an excellent introduction. And by the way, in case you didn't know, when it says CCC 134, for example, on page 7, it's the second paragraph, it means the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 134. Not page, paragraph, because it doesn't matter what version you have, even if you look at it online, you'll be able to find what paragraph that is referencing. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, good. I wanted to make sure that you understood that. I think there is an intro to that in here, but I could be wrong. All right, maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, let's move on. All right, page 87 and 88. The introduction to the Song of Songs, the author and the date. Since we need to understand the Song of Songs in terms of what era of history it came out of, this is an important question. Who was its author, who wrote it, and when? So group 4. What is the traditional author of the Song of Songs? Who is the traditional author? That's correct. Very good. Yes. The traditional author of the book, and we mean traditional meaning that from earliest rabbinic history and times, the traditional author was King Solomon, the son of David. What are some of the elements to substantiate that? What proof or evidence would you have for that?
We struggle to find some, but we come across uniformity of style and recurrent images.
Okay.
And then of course literary unity and substance of the modern style.
Good. Very good. The 1 through 6 are actually on the first paragraph of page 87. Go ahead, Tony. Solomon's name appears in the book, yes? Yes, he was a prolific songwriter. He wrote over 1,000 songs, according to 1 Kings 4:32.